The Duke banished his own Duchess, not knowing she carried his heir. A Georgian manor burning gold against a black, stormy sky. Rain falling in silver sheets across grounds that were once hers. A pregnant Duchess standing alone on the wet lawn. Dark velvet cloak soaked through, both hands cradling her belly, face tilted forward into the dark. In the upper window, a single silhouette, motionless, watching. He does not come down. She does not call up. She turns and walks into the night. If you have ever watched someone throw away the most precious thing they possessed without even realizing it, stay with me, because this is that story. And I promise you, by the end of it, you will feel every single moment of what it cost them both. If you are new here, subscribe and hit the bell. These stories drop every week, and you do not want to miss what is coming. Night had descended upon Deverell Hall like a verdict already written, heavy and absolute, pressing against the tall Georgian windows with the quiet certainty of something that could not be undone. The air inside the Duke's private study was still, the kind of stillness that precedes not a storm, but a sentence. Candlelight from the iron chandelier above cast long, wavering shadows across walls lined with ancestral portraits, each painted face as cold and unmoved as the man who stood behind the mahogany desk. Vivienne Ashcroft, Duchess of Deverell, stood at the window, her fingers resting lightly on the ledge, watching the first threads of rain begin to trace their way down the glass, slow, then insistent, like accusations she had no way to answer. She was 23 years old. She'd become a duchess at 21, delivered into an arranged union that both families had described, with great ceremony and very little warmth, as a merging of two distinguished legacies. The Ashcrofts of Wiltshire, the Deverells of Kent, ancient names, older silences. The marriage had never been lit by anything as inconvenient as passion, and she had chosen, deliberately, not to mourn that. She had arrived at Deverell Hall with her dignity intact, learned every corridor, memorized every tenant's name, managed the household accounts with a precision that made Mrs. Birch weep quietly with relief. She had been, by every external measure, an exemplary duchess. And still there was the wall, invisible, immovable, constructed of something colder than stone, existing precisely between where she ended and where Leighton Deverell began. A question offered at dinner and returned unanswered, a hand extended in the dark and never taken. 2 years of small, careful efforts dissolving against a barrier she could feel but never name. The clock on the mantelpiece marked the half-hour. She heard him before she saw him, the measured fall of his footsteps on the marble corridor, each step placed with the precision of a man who had never needed to rush toward anything. She knew that walk the way one knows the sound of approaching weather. It had a quality tonight she could not name, not anger, not grief, something more unnerving than either, something final. Vivienne straightened. She turned from the window, smoothing her hands once, just once, across the deep crimson velvet of her gown before letting them settle, steady and still, at her sides. The pearl earrings at her ears caught the candlelight. She lifted her chin by precisely the degree required to meet whatever was coming with her face fully composed. The door opened. Leighton Deverell entered a room the way certain forces of nature enter a landscape, not violently, but with a completeness that rearranged everything around him simply by virtue of his presence. Tall, broad-shouldered, dark-haired, dressed in his evening coat with the exacting neatness of a man for whom appearance was a form of armor. Dark eyes, not cold exactly, but stripped of warmth, the way a winter sky is stripped of color. He crossed the study floor without hesitation, without any of the small social softeners that less certain men deployed. He stopped at the desk, He looked at her, and Vivienne understood in the space of that single look that what she had told herself across 2 years of patient evenings had been wrong. It was not patience he required of her. It was not time or proximity or devotion. What Leighton Deverell required, she now understood with devastating clarity, was someone else entirely. "Vivienne," he said. "Not Duchess, not my dear, just her name, spoken with the flat, precise neutrality of a man concluding an administrative matter, as though she were a ledger entry he had finally found the courage to correct." What followed was not a conversation, it was a pronouncement. The Deverell line required an heir. 2 years had produced none. And the union had fulfilled its social purpose and would now be formally dissolved. A settlement, a pension, a small property. The matter arranged quietly to protect both families from unnecessary gossip. He slid a document across the desk. Vivienne did not look at it. "Is there anything further, Your Grace?" she asked. Her voice did not shake. She would die before she let it shake. He said nothing. She nodded once, turned, walked to the door. In the marble entrance hall, Mrs. Birch was waiting, not by coincidence. The older woman's eyes were red at the rims. She pressed a folded white handkerchief into Vivienne's hand without a word, and Vivienne pressed her fingers briefly over the woman's and said nothing either, because some things are beyond the reach of language. The front door opened. The rain hit her immediately, cold, relentless, indifferent. She pulled her black velvet cloak tight with one hand and pressed the other, instinctively, protectively, against the full curve of her belly. He had not mentioned it, not once in that entire conversation. He had never noticed. She walked forward into the dark and did not look back. In the upper window, a silhouette stood motionless and watched her go. He did not come down. The secret she carried left with her, growing quietly beneath her heart, unhurried and absolute, as certain as rain. The Ashcroft family cottage sat at the outermost edge of Renford village, like something the landscape had simply forgotten to clear away. Stone walls softened by decades of ivy, windows fogged with years of emptiness. It had belonged to a distant branch of her family, abandoned a generation ago. Vivienne had not known it existed until Tam told her. Tam was a woodworker, quietly built, unhurried in speech, with hands permanently stained with walnut oil. He had once done carpentry work on the Deverell estate stables and had recognized her on the road in the rain, with the matter-of-fact concern of a man who saw a pregnant woman alone in a storm and asked no questions beyond the only one that mattered. "Is there somewhere I can take you?" There was not, and so he had brought her here instead. The cottage was cold, crumbling. It smelled of damp stone and the particular silence of a space that had not held a human life in a very long time. Vivienne walked through it on that first night, candle in hand, and felt, to her own profound surprise, something that was not despair, something more like recognition. This was hers. Not by title, not by arrangement. Hers by the simple and radical fact that she was standing in it and no one could remove her from it. The first 2 nights she slept. Deeply, completely, in a way she had not slept in 2 years. On the 3rd night she could not sleep at all. She sat in the single armchair Tam had placed before the fireplace, hands folded over her belly, and allowed reality to arrive in full. She was 23. She was alone. She was with child, a child whose father had banished her without noticing she was carrying him. She had a ruined cottage, a modest sum of money, and a formidable education that the world she had just been expelled from had never once asked her to use. She sat with all of that for a long time, and then, quietly, without drama, in the way that the most important decisions are always made, Vivienne Ashcroft stopped being a woman things had happened to and became a woman deciding what happened next. She was not broken. She was calculating. This was where the real Vivienne began. She entered Renford in plain gray wool, hair pinned simply, no jewelry except the small pearl earrings she could not bring herself to remove. They had been her mother's. She asked Tam to introduce her simply as Vivienne. The village was small and regarded her with the frank assessment of a community that took careful measure of strangers. There was a schoolroom behind the church that had been without a teacher for 3 months. Vivienne heard this in passing and filed it away. That afternoon, she presented herself to the village elder, Mr. Dowell, who looked at her with the measured skepticism of someone who had seen well-meaning newcomers arrive with enthusiasm and depart before the first frost. "I have time," Vivienne told him, "and I have knowledge, and I will still be here in February." He gave her the key. She began the following morning with 6 children. Within a month there were 19. She taught with a directness and a lack of condescension the children responded to immediately, not performing patience, not speaking down to them, simply present with them in a way she had never been permitted to be present in any room at Deverell Hall. The village watched her, cautiously first, then with something approaching warmth. She was learning, slowly, the difference between grace and performance. "Comment right now. What do you think Leighton is doing at Deverell Hall while Vivienne is building this life? I'll tell you in a moment. And it is not what you might expect. The flood came on a Tuesday in late October without adequate warning. 3 days of relentless rain had saturated the ground beyond its capacity, and when the river along Renford's eastern boundary exceeded its banks, the water moved through the lower streets with quiet, unstoppable conviction. By dawn, the lower cottages were knee-deep. The road to the nearest town was impassable. They were effectively alone. Vivienne was at the schoolroom when the alarm went up. She was out of the building before she had consciously decided to move, standing in the street, taking in the situation with the same focused clarity she had brought to Deverell Hall's household accounts, to every administrative task that had been given to her over 2 years and silently, perfectly executed. The difference was that here, no one was waiting to approve her decisions. Within the hour, she had established the church as shelter for the most vulnerable. She directed the carts to the lower streets. She organized the women into a supply chain moving food and blankets from the upper village. She kept 37 displaced villagers calm, warm, and fed across 4 days without sleeping more than 2 hours at a stretch, her feet swelling from the standing, her back aching with the persistence of late pregnancy. And she said nothing about either. When the water receded, Vivienne sat down on the church steps in thin autumn sunshine and allowed herself, for exactly 4 minutes, to feel the weight of exhaustion. Tam sat down beside her without invitation and handed her a cup of tea that was somehow still hot. "You knew what to do," he said. "I always knew," Vivienne replied. "No one ever asked me before." She was no longer the woman at the Ashcroft cottage. She was Vivienne, full stop. The village had decided, and she felt the shift the way one feels a change in the quality of light. Not dramatic, but total. At Deverell Hall, the East Corridor had acquired a groove. Not literally. The marble was too old and too hard for that. But Leighton Deverell had walked its length so many times in the weeks following Vivienne's departure that Mrs. Birch had begun privately counting the passes as a measure of how badly things were going. What she did not know, what he had not permitted anyone to know, was what those walks actually were. They were not administration. They were not the purposeful movement of a man with somewhere to be. They were the physical expression of a thought he could not complete, a sentence that started every evening when he passed the door of the room that had been hers and ended nowhere. The thought had no conclusion because the conclusion required him to acknowledge something he had organized his entire adult life around not acknowledging. That he had been wrong. Not strategically wrong, not administratively wrong. The kind of wrong that can be corrected with a revised decision. Wrong in the way that strips a man of his confidence in his own judgment. Wrong about what mattered. wrong about what he had been looking at for 2 years and consistently failed to see. The estate ledgers told him first. He had not expected that, had not expected grief to announce itself through columns of figures. But the accounts for October were less precise than September, less elegant, less thorough. And September had been less precise than the preceding 12 months, every one of which bore the unmistakable marks of a woman who brought the same quality of attention to household management that she brought to everything else she did, everything else he had never bothered to notice her doing. He stood at the east corridor window late one evening and permitted himself, for the first time, to reconstruct that night with honesty. He had delivered the banishment with the flat efficiency of a man who had decided the matter was purely practical. He had not looked at her, not really, as she stood across the desk. He had not permitted himself to, because looking at her would have required him to feel something, and feeling something would have complicated the decision. He had not noticed she was with child. He sat with that fact in the dark and could not find a single angle from which it did not condemn him entirely. He was still sitting there when Mrs. Birch appeared, with her 31 years of accumulated moral authority and the expression of a woman who had decided tonight was the night. She told him where Vivienne was, what she had built, what she had done during the flood, how the village spoke of her. She did not tell him about the pregnancy, that truth was not hers to deliver, but she told him everything else, in the plain, precise language of a woman who understood that the most useful thing she could sometimes do was hand a powerful man what he had asked everyone around him not to give him. Leighton listened with his face arranged in the expression he deployed for information he intended to dismiss. "Thank you, Mrs. Birch. That will be all." She withdrew. He remained at the window a long time. The house was as ordered and correct as it had always been. Every surface polished, every appointment kept, every social obligation fulfilled with mechanical precision. And it was unbearable. It had been unbearable since the night of the rain. Not because he missed a Duchess, not because the household machinery had lost a component, but because somewhere in 3 weeks of East Corridor pacing, the truth he had been outrunning had finally caught him. He missed Vivienne, not the title, not the function, her. The woman who had stood across that desk and asked, "Is there anything further?" Your Grace, with a voice that did not shake when every instinct she possessed must have been screaming. The woman who had looked through him at dinner 100 times with a patience he had never once deserved. He sat alone in the dark for a very long time. And then, somewhere around 2 a.m, he stopped sitting. He rode out alone at dawn, without announcement, without escort, and without any of the words he had been attempting to arrange since the night Mrs. Birch had stood in his corridor and dismantled his composure with the quiet efficiency of someone who had been waiting decades for the appropriate moment. The ride took the better part of the morning. He used the hours badly, cycling through openings, discarding them, arriving at nothing that did not sound like either an excuse or an order. He was experienced enough with his own limitations to know that Vivienne would receive either with the same impenetrable composure she had deployed in his study on the night he had made the worst decision of his adult life. He found the cottage without difficulty. He dismounted at the gate and stood for a moment looking at the property. It had been repaired. New timber in the window frames. Fresh mortar on the garden wall. Someone had planted winter herbs along the front path. Rosemary and sage, still green against the gray November ground. It was modest. It was cared for. It was unmistakably a home. Vivienne was in the garden, heavily pregnant, wearing a plain brown dress and canvas apron, kneeling beside a flower bed with a trowel. She looked up when she heard the gate. Not surprise, not warmth, not anger, which he had been braced for. Just the calm, measuring look of a woman who had no remaining interest in performing any reaction she did not genuinely feel. She set down the trowel. She stood slowly. She did not offer her hand. "Leighton," she said. "Not your Grace. just his name. He heard the echo of his own voice from the night of the rain, and the recognition was not comfortable. "Vivienne," he said, and then, because everything he had prepared had abandoned him, "You have been well." She looked at him for a long, steady moment. "Come in," she said. "I will make tea." The cottage kitchen was small and warm and smelled of wood smoke and dried herbs. She moved around it with a certainty and ease that struck him. This was not a woman enduring a diminished existence. This was a woman entirely at home in a space she had built for herself, requiring nothing from outside its walls. He sat at the small table. She set a cup before him without ceremony. "Why are you here?" she asked, simply directly, in the way she had always been capable of speaking and had suppressed for 2 years. He said the only true thing he could. "Because the house is wrong without you. Because I have walked the East Corridor every evening since you left and cannot tell you why, and that itself should have told me something long before now." Vivienne was quiet for a moment. "You banished a Duchess, Leighton," she said. "You had no idea you were also banishing yourself." He had no defense against that. He did not attempt one. He stayed for 2 hours. They resolved nothing. She did not ask him to leave. He rode home in the dark, understanding, for the first time, that the distance between where he was and where he needed to be was measurable, and that measuring it was entirely his responsibility. He did not sleep, but for the first time in weeks, the insomnia felt less like punishment and more like purpose. Lady Pemworth arrived at Deverell Hall 4 days after Leighton's visit to Renford, having learned of it through channels she did not intend to identify, and presented herself in his study with the expression of a woman who had decided to resolve a situation before it developed in a direction she had not approved. She was Leighton's paternal aunt, 60 years old, due with the social influence of a woman who had spent 4 decades collecting obligations from people who could not afford to refuse her. She had opposed the match from the beginning. Too quiet, she had said of Vivienne, too self-contained, the kind of woman who thinks too much and produces too little. She had received the banishment with a satisfaction she had not quite managed to conceal, and Leighton's subsequent change of direction alarmed her in the way that only genuinely threatened people are alarmed. She told him what she intended to do, the terms she would offer Vivienne to ensure her permanent and quiet withdrawal from any Deverell claim, the arguments she would deploy, the social consequences she would arrange. Leighton listened to all of it. Then he told her, in the same quiet, unhurried tone he used for all administrative matters, that she would do none of it, that Vivienne was his Duchess, that she had always been his Duchess, that the dissolution of their marriage had been an error in judgment he intended to correct through every legal and social instrument available to him, and that any member of the family, any member, who moved against Vivienne's position would find themselves excised from the Deverell Trust with the same efficiency and the same absence of personal animosity. Lady Pemworth left the study without another word. It was, Leighton reflected afterward, the first time in his adult life he had said exactly what he meant the moment it needed to be said. He found the feeling notable. He intended to repeat it. Drop a comment. Did that moment earn Leighton even a fraction of your trust? Because what happens next is the scene Vivienne has been building toward since the night she walked out into the rain. She's about to stand at the head of the Deverell table, face every person who ever dismissed her, and speak. And she does not ask for a single thing. The summons went out to every branch of the Deverell family in the 2nd week of November. Leighton had drafted them himself, without consultation, in the plain, decisive language of a man who had finished asking for opinions and started making statements. They came, cousins, uncles, connected households, the satellite relations that orbit a great family, with the mixture of curiosity, apprehension, and thinly veiled appetite for drama that characterizes family gatherings convened without explanation. Lady Pemworth arrived last. The Deverell dining hall had not been this full in years. The long mahogany table was at capacity. The portraits of 7 generations of Deverell dukes looked down from the walls with their customary ancestral assessment. Leighton stood at the head of the table. He did not sit. He spoke for 7 minutes. He revoked the banishment. He restored Vivienne's title, her rights, her standing, and her position in the Deverell will, as primary heir should their child be a girl, and as co-guardian of any male heir until the age of majority. He stripped Lady Pemworth of her formal standing in the household. He informed the assembled family that any member who chose to contest these arrangements would find themselves removed from the family trust with the same efficiency and the same absence of personal animosity he brought to all administrative matters. He then stepped back from the head of the table, half a step, deliberate, and he looked at the chair to his right. Vivienne stood. She had come in quietly, with Mrs. Birch at her side, Mrs. Birch who had driven 3 hours to be present for this, whose expression as she took her position at the door was the expression of a woman who had waited 31 years for a room to finally be arranged correctly. Vivienne was 8 months pregnant. She wore deep green velvet, not the crimson of the woman who had stood at the study window in the rain. Green, the color of something growing. Her hair was dressed simply. Her pearl earrings caught the candlelight. She looked around the table. She did not rush. "I will not ask for your approval," she said. Her voice was quiet and carried to every corner of the room without effort, the voice of a woman who had learned, in the months just past, that authority does not require volume. "I will not ask for warmth, or welcome, or any performance of affection from people who do not feel it. I know what many of you think of me. I have known it since before I arrived in this house." She paused. "I am the Duchess of Deverell. I am the mother of the next Deverell heir. I did not scheme for either of these things. I did not fight for them, or manipulate for them, or use my child as a weapon to reclaim them, though I was given every reason and every opportunity to do so." Her hands rested lightly on the curve of her belly. "What I did instead was survive. What I built instead was a life. And what I am offering this family now, in this room, is not an appeal for acceptance. It is a notification of fact." She looked once at Lady Pemworth. "I did not come back to be tolerated. I came back because I chose to. Remember the difference." She sat down. The room was entirely silent. It was Lady Pemworth who broke it, not with a challenge, not with dismissal, with 2 words, in the voice of a woman revising an assessment she had held for 3 years. "The girl," she said to no one in particular, "has backbone." It was not warm acceptance. It was not approval. But it was recognition, from the one person in that room whose concession meant the most. Mrs. Birch, standing at the door, allowed herself one small, private smile. If that speech gave you chills, give this video a like, and keep watching. The ending is worth everything. February arrived at Deverell Hall with frost on the garden and a sky the pale, even gray of a held breath. The grounds were quiet in the particular way of a house that is waiting. Leighton had been waiting since 4 in the morning. He had established himself in the corridor outside Vivienne's chamber with the focused immovability of a man who had decided that his most important task was to remain exactly where he was. He had brought nothing to occupy himself. No correspondence, no estate papers, because to bring anything would have been to pretend that anything else existed in the world tonight. Mrs. Birch passed him at intervals. She brought tea. She suggested twice that he might be more comfortable in the sitting room below. He declined both times with the quiet refusal of a man who understood at last the difference between watching from a window and being present. He was present. At 7:30 in the morning, The sounds from within the chamber changed. Then silence. Then, cleaving through it, the cry of a new voice announcing itself to Deverell Hall with the furious, unqualified insistence of someone who had opinions about the world and intended to share them immediately. Leighton's hand found the wall. The door opened. "Your Grace has a daughter." He entered. Vivienne was propped against the pillows, her auburn hair loose and damp, her face carrying the luminous exhaustion of a woman who had done something extraordinary and knew it. In her arms, wrapped in white flannel, was a small, red-faced, entirely perfect person examining the ceiling with the focused intensity of someone cataloging everything wrong with it. Leighton sat at the edge of the bed with the careful reverence of a man who understood he was in the presence of something that required gentleness. "She has your eyes," Vivienne said. He looked. The baby's eyes, dark, alert, regarding him now with the frank assessment of someone forming an opinion. He found he could not speak. "She should have a name," Vivienne said. "Rosalind," he said. "Rosalind Vivienne Deverell." Vivienne looked at him for a long moment, then at her daughter, and then back at him. He moved from the edge of the bed to his knees, the Duke of Deverell on the cold floor of the birth chamber, because there was no other position that adequately expressed what he needed to say. "I see you," he said. "I should have always seen you. I am sorry it took me this long to become someone capable of it." Vivienne was quiet. The baby made a small, decisive sound and closed her fist around Vivienne's finger. "Then don't stop," Vivienne said. "See me every day. That is all I ask." He took her free hand. He did not let go. Outside, the frost on the Deverell gardens caught the first light of the winter morning and held it. The manor windows glowed warm. In the years that followed, Renford's schoolroom was expanded twice. The second time funded quietly by the Duke of Deverell at the suggestion of his Duchess, who continued riding out to the village twice weekly because it was hers, and she had built it, and she was not the kind of woman who abandoned things she had built. Mrs. Birch retired to a cottage on the estate grounds that Leighton had prepared without being asked. She spent her afternoons teaching Rosalind, who had her father's dark eyes and her mother's absolute certainty about everything, to bake. And Leighton learned, slowly, imperfectly, and with the patient instruction of a woman who had decided he was worth the effort, to come downstairs. Every day. Without fail. It was, they both agreed, a good start. Tell me in the comments, what was your single favorite moment in this story? Mine is Leighton on his knees. He earned those knees. I need to know yours. Subscribe and hit the bell. New stories every week. You do not want to miss what is coming next. If this story moved you, like this video, 2 seconds, it genuinely changes how many people this story reaches. Share this with someone who loves historical romance, powerful women, and stories that earn their endings. See you